Well, hello there. I am Athena Aktipis. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at ASU, and I am also the host of the Zombified podcast. I've got some of the images back here from my podcast, and I also am the producer of Channel Z. So I usually talk about zombies, but today, why don't we talk about cannibals? I'm going to be talking about two cannibals today. One is cancer cells, and the other is memes. So, when we think about these kinds of processes like cancer cells and viral memes, it makes us realize that we're actually a lot more vulnerable than we might like to think. And these, I think, are really good examples of how cannibalistic forces can arise, literally from us, out of the meat of our bodies and the electrical signals of our brain, and kind of eat us from the inside out. Not just metaphorically, actually. And cancer cells quite literally do consume us. So the very big picture of what cancer is that it's essentially a cheater in the cooperation that usually is what makes multicellular life viable. So in the evolution of multicellularity, basically you had this situation where cells started to cooperate to make larger entities and work together to gather resources, distribute those resources, reproduce as a unit, and constrain their own individual replication for the good of the organism, and lots of other cooperative things that make it possible for us to be who we are as multicellular life. But what cancer cells do is they break all of those cooperative rules. They replicate out of control. And for the case of what we're talking about here in terms of cannibalism, critically, they actually consume the resources of the body in a way that is not consistent with the sort of cooperative rules that other cells follow. So cancer cells will consume more resources than normal cells. They will leave waste products in their wake, and they actually will even cannibalize healthy cells to turn them into raw materials that then help them to reproduce, to divide, to create more cancer cells. In fact, there's this phenomenon called cachexia in late stage cancer, where patients will literally be starving even though they have plenty of nutrients. They could be on an IV drip, but no matter how much you put into them, they are emaciated and they are quite literally starving. And this paradox, it happens because the cancer cells in the body are actually sending signals to the normal cells that are there, basically telling those cells the organism is starving and they need to sacrifice their resources to keep the body alive. But what is actually happening is that those resources that get created when these cells sort of self-destruct in this sort of organized way, is those resources then feed the cancer cells. So cancer is a very literal, real process of kind of being, in some cases, eaten from the inside out. It's terrifying, it's frightening, but it is the reality. And because cancer cells do arise from the cells of our body, from our own cells, they are in a real sense part of who we are, or at least continuous with who we are, or who we thought we were before they started to take over. Now, not to end this on a totally apocalyptic note in terms of cancer, it is possible to keep cancer under control. And if you look at also prevention, in many cases, by sort of taking into account the evolutionary process and approaching cancer in a way of trying to manage it and control the environment and keep cancer cells from taking advantage too much of the body, it's possible to keep them under control. And we'll come back at the end to some of what we know about sort of how we can sort of deal with and keep ourselves from being eaten alive. All right, now on to memes. I said I'd talk about memes. So if cancer cells are eating our bodies from the inside out, memes can eat our brains from the inside out. I think of them quite literally as self-replicating brain eaters. Now they might not actually be consuming our neurons in the same way that cancer cells can consume the cells of our body, but they can change the way that our brains are structured, creating new connections that weren't there before, writing over old connections with, things that maybe we didn't actually intend to take up into our brains. So, if you think of things like the Baby Shark song or some other, viral, like what we call it, earworm, right? Something that's taking over your nervous system. It literally can make it hard to think of anything else. And I think this is a really interesting aspect of memes. And also, when we think of memes, very often we sort of just think of like what's on the internet and what people are sharing on the internet. But really, memes are anything that we can think and then share with others, any piece of information that we can transmit socially. And, this is often facilitated by silicone, right? This brain-to-brain transmission in the form of our computers and our smartphones. But memes are a much more fundamental thing. They are really, any piece of socially transmitted information that then, can propagate itself, right? So with, certain kinds of songs, maybe we feel compelled to sing them, which then helps them, survive in us and potentially also colonize other brains of our friends or our family members if they hear us. And then there's other things that are a little bit sort of more pernicious, like conspiracy theories, for example, where they are hijacking our evolved psychology, our concern about our own safety, our own well-being, or threats that are from other groups. And what can happen then is, as sort of our brains get hijacked by that, then if we are then compelled to share them with others, that helps those memes propagate themselves and reach fresh new brains that then they can begin to eat and use as tools for further propagating themselves. Now, I don't mean to say here or imply that memes or cancer cells are doing any of this intentionally. Of course, they don't, have a brain like ours where they can represent their own intentions. But the fact is that evolution has shaped both cancer cells and memes to do this. So if we ask ourselves, why is it that cancer cells and conspiracy theories both have the power to cannibalize us? The answer is evolution by natural selection. Both of these cannibalistic forces get their power from this slow, but in this case, pernicious process of natural selection. So cancer cells evolved to cannibalize us because those cancer cells that are best at capturing our bodily resources, they survive longer and make the most copies of themselves. Memes, whether they're ideas, theories, or songs, they evolved to cannibalize us because those memes that are best at hijacking our brains to perpetuate them end up making the most copies of themselves. So it's not an intentional process. It is evolution by natural selection. So at this point, you might be wondering, how can you avoid being eaten alive? So a few little tips to end us out here. So one is be aware of what you are taking in. So I would say try not to invite cannibals to the table or feed the cannibals that are already there. So, for example, when it comes to cancer, we actually know that the best way to prevent cancer is to eat lots of fruits and vegetables and to exercise. And what it looks like is happening with these kinds of behavior changes is that you literally are feeding the less cannibalistic cells, the normal cells of the body, and starving out the cancer cells that actually are more metabolically demanding. So if you are having lots of excess sugars and nutrients, that can potentially actually feed the cells that you don't want there. And it's also the case that fasting helps during treatment for cancer, probably because the cancer cells just have a much higher metabolism, and so they're more vulnerable to dying if they don't have a huge source of constant resources, which is, of course, also where the need for them to cannibalize us comes from. And similarly, you can avoid being eaten alive by not inviting cannibalistic memes to the table, or feeding the cannibalistic memes that are already there. So, be careful about what you are paying attention to online, and especially what you're sharing, because you are potentially making yourself an agent of their propagation if you spread memes that are damaging to the world, but might actually be able to themselves benefit from being propagated because they make more copies of themselves and spread. So I will leave you with those words, and I hope that you've maybe learned a little bit about how you can avoid being eaten alive, or at least you'll be a little bit more aware of how your body and brains are being liquefied as you're being cannibalized by yourself. Thank you.